Well, welcome everyone to this edition of the Mathewson-Plank Virtual Book Club meeting. Today we're going to be talking about the book, The Whiz Kids, how the 1950 Phillies took the pennant, lost the World Series, and changed Philadelphia baseball forever. And it was written by Dennis Snelling, and this is Dennis's fifth book. His other books are Lefty O'Doul, Baseball's Forgotten Ambassador, Johnny Evers, A Baseball Life, The Greatest Minor League, A History of the Pacific Coast League, 1903 to 1957, and A Glimpse of Fame, Brilliant but Fleeting Major League Careers. Three of Dennis's books were finalists for the Casey Award, which honors the best baseball book of the year, and his Johnny Evers book was a finalist for SABR's Seymour Medal for Best Book of Baseball History or Biography. Dennis is joining us this morning from California. He's a member of SABR and also a member of the Pacific Coast League Historical Society. And Dennis, I know where you are. It's a little after 7 o'clock in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate you getting up early and joining us. Let's see. Most of our primary members are within 100 miles of Philadelphia, Dennis, and probably within 75 miles of Reading, PA, where the Phillies AA minor league affiliate plays. So you're going to have quite a few Phillies fans on the call today. So with that, I'll turn the meeting over to you, and you can tell us about your book and the 1950 Phillies.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for having me here. Probably some of you will be able to tell me some things I don't know about the Phillies. Phillies fans are well known for their uh, understanding a history of both of their team and baseball. So um, I think that was one of the things that attracted me to the project is I think, to try to um, come up with a way of talking about this team maybe in a different way than it has. Um, the book's really divided into three sections in a way. There's kind of an introductory section that kind of ties the history not only of the Phillies, but all of Philadelphia baseball. Because Philadelphia played a key role in the early formation of the game and kind of up through the different ownership issues and some of the colorful stories, but basically to talk about the frustration that the franchise had for so long and why, kind of to put into context, why the 1950 Phillies had such an impact on the sports world in Philadelphia and the fans of Philadelphia. And really, the timing of it couldn't have been better for the franchise because, um, baseball was going through a tumultuous phase where people coming back from the war were having young families and had money and disposable income. And now there was much more competition for the entertainment dollar. And where baseball boomed briefly, 46, 47, by 48, it was starting to fade a little bit. And that created the problem of having two team cities. Chicago and New York survived, but Boston, St. Louis, and Philadelphia in combination with the battle over the antitrust suits, that baseball was facing, was going to force moving of some franchises. And if the Phillies hadn't had their success at the time they did, it probably would have been them that had moved. Um, it wasn't a given. The Athletics were really the dominant franchise. They outdrew the Phillies every year except for maybe a half a dozen between their founding and 1949. Uh, the Athletics had more success. They'd won several World Series. They'd had a lot of down times. But Connie Mack was kind of the face of Philadelphia baseball, not the Phillies or anyone related to the Phillies. So the first part of the book kind of talks about that because one of the reasons that I wrote this is um, I had a passing familiarity with the Phillies' history. I've been a fan since I was 8 years old, so the mid 60s of baseball. And So, and I've always loved history and baseball history. So I knew, that, in the 70s, I knew the Phillies still had never won a World Series and had been around for almost 100 years to that point. And I knew about the 1915 World Series where they'd won the first game, then lost the last four all by one run. And at the 1950 series, they also lost all those games by one run, except for the fourth game. And a lot of their history. And then, of course, then I wrote the book on Lefty O'Doul, which, of course, he had two tremendous seasons in Philadelphia, one where he set National League records that still stand today, including number of hits in a season and some amazing statistics, 32 home runs and only striking out 19 times. You won't see that anymore. And then 1930 really knocking the Cubs out of the pennant in a weekend pretty much by himself. So I kind of touched on Phillies, but the premise of the book is sort of why a team that lost is almost treated as a champion. And there's maybe a couple of other examples I can think of. The Impossible Dream Boston Red Sox, where the Red Sox having a history that in some ways paralleled the Phillies after Babe Ruth's trade, where there was a lot of frustration and not a lot of success. One World Series and some tremendous players and some tremendous individual things. So it was like, why is this? And then they were a young team that they were built well, and then they didn't repeat. And everybody, if you look back at articles written in the 1950s, I mean, Connie Mack thought they'd win five more pennants. He was probably exaggerating a little bit, but he did think they were a really great ball club. And a lot of people thought the Phillies would be a dynasty during the 50s, and yet it was the Dodgers that won most of the pennants and the Giants to a secondary degree. So why is that? How are dynasties built? How long is the opportunity for them, and how are opportunities to establish them lost? So that's part of this. And of course, talking about the people involved, both at the management level and the playing level. So the book has the history leading up to when Herb Pennock and Bob Carpenter took over the team, then kind of the building of the team. The middle part of the book is really about the 49 and 50 seasons where the Phillies became a contender and then got over the top. And of course, that dramatic ending to the 1950 season where there's so many parallels between what happened in 1950 and 1964 for the Phillies. Very similar Septembers, except the Phillies in 1950 pulled it out and in 64 they didn't. And then why didn't the last third of the book is really about why didn't they repeat? And there are threads through, there's one chapter that deals mostly with the original signing of Curt Simmons and Robin Roberts and the beginning of their careers. And then there's another chapter towards the end of the book that really deals with their careers after the Phillies leaving there and what happened to them. And their careers lasted they came in together, they left in a lot of ways together. Yet their endings were a little different from each other. They were intertwined. They became friends. They were business partners, and so just kind of, even though they were opposites in a lot of ways, I found that fascinating. And of course, touch on the attempted murder of Eddie Waitkus, which is fascinating. The Phillies have have a fascinating history, a lot of fascinating people, and it was an interesting team with a lot of interesting players. And so I always look for a good story to tell, and I think there was one here, and I hope I did it justice. Um, you know, I think it's an unusual story and one that is not unknown to people, but I hope I've put it into context and looked at it with a little different eye. Um, Again, when I write, I try to look for a good story. Um, I try to write in the present in a way. I have a prejudice towards trying to find accounts that are as close to the event as possible. Um, People's memories, you always talk about I find later quotes, sometimes I will use them, but I'm trying to be careful with that because people's memories, we always talk about eyewitness accounts and things like that, and stories change over time. I remember a player in one of these a SABR meeting I attended adamantly saying, no, the first pitcher I faced was so and so, and I remember I should remember because I was there. And it's like, well, nobody argued with him, but you could go to the newspaper accounts, find out, no, that was your second game that you faced that player, and that's normal. For some people have better recall than others, and so that's one of the more difficult things I think to when you're doing these kinds of projects is making that judgment call, because even stuff that happened at the time can be exaggerated at the time or inaccurate. You have to be kind of skeptical, ask whatever questions, but in the end of the day you kind of have to make a judgment call. But I'll give you an example of why you don't use uh, just a quote from somebody. There's one in the book where when Kurt Simmons was released by the Phillies, his version, and these were, you know, the quote from him was that Gene Mauch never came and told him he was cut, didn't tell him in person. Robin Roberts, who was his roommate, says, no, Gene Mauch did come up and tell him in person. So one of those is wrong, or maybe both. And so I just thought it was interesting that here's two people that were supposedly there at the same time and have a completely different version. And so that's one of the things I think you have to do when you're doing especially history or biography is kind of, does this make sense? I mean, I'm still wrestling honestly with the Richie Ashburn story of him hitting a woman twice with a foul ball. Her family says that happened. I have some trouble believing that she was hit, people came down and attended to her, and then she starts being carried off in a stretcher, and Ashburn's at bat lasted that long. Now it's possible, and the family still swears it happened, but I can't find contemporary newspaper accounts. Maybe one of you has one and you can give it to. I'd love to see it. But it's examples like that that you just go. So I put it in a footnote and I talk about it, and I don't know whether it happened or not, but I wasn't confident enough to put it in the main uh, narrative. So those are kind of examples of how I uh, go about doing this. And then I like to write in the present. You know what's going to happen, but I like to have things unfold in a way, if I can, that you would feel them as a reader. If you were picking up the newspaper that day, this would be your version of where the Phillies are right now and the impact of what happened on that day. Even though they're going to pull it out, it's kind of trying to do that. And so I find going back to those accounts, you bring that uh, view into your writing, I think. And so that's what I try to do. And I try to balance a lot of research into still telling an entertaining story, not letting the research get in the way of the story. Sometimes I'm more successful at that than others. That's one of the struggles. I mean, and that's part of the trouble with, I always talk about nonfiction. Part of the struggle is that you're never really done with a nonfiction book. You just have to end because there's always more to learn. You know, one example I'll give is Richie Ashburn throwing out Cal Abrams at home plate. It was recently that it kind of struck me. Bert Schotten talked about, well, Richie Ashburn never threw anybody out, and I say in the book, well, that was an exaggeration. Plus, it really didn't matter anyway. And it was only recently. I wish I'd thought about it earlier. It's only recently I go, I had to look up uh, how many times Ashburn threw someone out at the plate because you have baseball reference now. The thing you do have to do is you still have to tell you have baseball reference, but even those play-by-play things have some errors in them and bugs, and so you always want to go back to the game accounts, cross-check. And there were a couple times that the game account, the baseball reference would say threw someone out at home, and you'd look up the game account and it didn't happen. But I did find 4 instances where he had thrown players out at home plate, including just a week before that game against the Dodgers in 1950. He threw out Eddie Stanky at home plate in a game against the Giants. So Shotton should have had a better scouting report, I guess. But it's an example of how you're always learning, and so that's another struggle I think with doing nonfiction. Whereas if you're writing a novel, you're kind of you have your little you have your world. So I'm not saying you writing a novel's easy. I admire people who could do that. I can't do that. But you do have a world you've created, and your sandbox is there. In a nonfiction, you kind of have to create your own sandbox, and then the temptation is you keep wanting to get out of it because you find interesting things and start going down roads, and that's what I use footnotes for. So anyway, I found the Phillies a fascinating story. I think I always think ownership is a really important factor in the success of a team. Certainly, the players have to be there, but you have to have an owner that has money and is patient. I mean, if you look at the Phillies' ownership history, to me is rather fascinating. They started out with a pretty solid duo of owners. They were financed in part by others, outsiders in the beginning, but Al Reach and John Rogers had some money. Reach certainly knew baseball. Rogers was a little bit more impetuous, and he was the one who was leading the lawsuits against the American League, largely because of uh, that Blageway jumping. But the Phillies were a really solid team for a couple decades. They just never got over the hump. They just really never had the pitching, but they had the all 400 hitting outfield and some fantastic players and really colorful team too. And some tragedy, Charlie Ferguson, of course, and uh, his death. But they were really good. And then the both the American League and Federal League hurt the Phillies some, and some of that was because the ownership players kind of were willing to leave rather than stay. And to me, ownership plays a big role in those kind of circumstances. And you ended up with a series of owners there that ended up in William Baker, who really didn't have money and didn't seem to care a whole lot. He was almost an absentee owner, and he kept holding on to the club, but he broke up a good club, and in frustration with the Federal League, I think in part, and then just kind of rode it into the ground. And then the Nugents tried to take over, and they actually had pretty good knowledge. They were pretty good knowledge of talent and things, but then they just couldn't make it. You had the depression going on at the same time that the baseball team was pretty much their only means and source of income. So they kept having to sell their best players off. You know, O'Doul lasted 2 years. Chuck Klein eventually was sold off, and then in the 30s and 40s they would sign good players and turn around and sell them off to keep the lights on. Then they were forced to sell the team. National League forced them to sell them to William Cox, who, interestingly enough, was one of the folks just with the ban just lifted, along with Pete Rose and Joe Jackson. William Cox was one of those who was reinstated into baseball because he got in trouble while he fired Bucky Harris, and Bucky Harris retaliated by ratting him out that he was gambling on his own team, and Landis, Commissioner Landis, didn't take kindly to that and banned him for life. That led to the Carpenters taking over the team, and now you had, especially when Bob Sr. turned it over to Bob Jr., now you had an owner with some money, some experience in baseball. He was a partner with Connie Mack in a minor league ball club and some other sports ventures, but he really cared about sports, and he understood, he had a strategy and patience to make that strategy pay off. And, uh, that's what I think turned them around finally. After, 40 years of not having solid ownership, they finally did. And, how solid that ownership was and how effective it was over a long period of time is open to debate, because they didn't repeat. But they got there because, largely because they had that, which they hadn't had before. And so I found that kind of interesting. But just as interesting was how stubborn they were Carpenter was in not changing his ways for whatever reasons, whether those were racial reasons or whether that was just, hey, we had success signing bonus babies out of high school in the 40s and we're going to do it in the 50s, and worked in the 40s and didn't in the 50s, and for whatever reason not recognizing how the landscape changed on April 15th, 1947. And the Phillies' own reputation, whether deserved or not, probably more deserved than not. Not only did they not sign players, but when they tried to sign black players didn't want to sign with them because that was the reputation they had, dating back to how Robinson was treated initially by the Phillies players. And so all of that, it's kind of really momentous if you're talking about baseball history through that time. The Phillies played roles both good and bad, and which I think is true of every franchise you're going to find. Everywhere there's people, there's going to be good and bad. And again, I just found it a fascinating story, and that's kind of how the book's structured, how I approached it, and I'm open to any questions people have.
Well, as somebody who's been writing a book about the 1911 to 1913 Giants forever, because like you said, you keep discovering new stuff. It's like I commend you on getting this finished, and it's a fascinating book. I just finished it 2 days ago. And I think you did find a good balance in how you told an interesting story with that was also well researched. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
The Charlie Ferguson story, I know it wasn't obviously the central position of your book, but gosh, I'm glad you put that in there because that was just fascinating. I had never heard that before. And it's interesting to compare to other teams that have had sort of a snake bitten history, like the California Angels.
Yeah.
Lost a number of players young, and I think Houston Astros as well. Teams that or franchises that struggled for a long time. It's like, well, the Phillies had several examples of that, as you pointed out. So.
Yeah, Ferguson, of course, was one of the more prominent ones, but you had a couple years later, you had Jim Fogarty, an outfielder,
Right.
and then in the late 20s, you had a couple of I think it was Walt Larian was killed in a car. A car went off the road and pinned him against a building or something, and I think there were a couple players like in 29-30 that they lost.
Mm-hmm.
And they've had their history of tragedy as well.
Right.
I just found the 1800s are really, I like 19th century baseball, not an expert in it by any means, but there were so many colorful characters and things that happened. And I love the story. I mean, the story of the third base coach who would, when the Phillies were trying to steal signs and they had a backup catcher in center field with opera glasses,
right.
and he would signal the third base coach essentially by electrocuting him. He would stand in standing water with a wire underneath his feet and he'd get a shock, and that would tell him whether it was a fastball or not. It's just very interesting. There's a lot of interesting stories out there.
Right.
Dennis, do you think if Herb Pennant had lived longer, that they might have been more successful into the 50s?
I think that's a really good question, and I would tend to lean towards yes. Although, I think ultimately their success would have been how quickly they integrated. I think the National League teams, I think Richie Ashburn talked about this at one point, saying, all the other teams were getting better and we weren't. And tapping into that, there was a very narrow window of tapping into the best of that talent because it was a cheap pipeline. It probably wasn't fair, but they got these players for almost nothing, and they're
Right.
ready-made all-stars. And there's only so many of those. And once the Giants and Dodgers grabbed a lot of them, and the Braves did some of that too, there wasn't, there was a window of 3 or 4 years, and if you didn't act, Cleveland was grabbing a lot of them too over in the American League. Um, so the reaction to that might have been, whether it would have been different, that is to me a big part of what happened, why they didn't repeat. That, and you had people who had career years, and you had some pitching injuries that they just never really replaced. I mean, Bob Miller, that was a big, talk about a what might have been. I think Bob Miller, and then losing Kurt Simmons for a year and a half to military, and then because of his windup, he was always going to have arm problems intermittently in his career, which he did, but he was still an effective pitcher. He had some great years in his late 30s. So, but that, and Constanti, I mean, he was never going to have a season that great again. Sometimes that just happens, and where a guy just everything comes together. So they had to replace a lot. They had to replace Miller, Simmons, and Constanti's performances. Those guys, Miller and Constanti, either had to match their performances, which physically they weren't going to, and Simmons wasn't there. And Bubba Church had a little better year in '51, but that's getting into minutia a little bit. Your larger picture, I think it would have made a difference. I mean, they went without a general manager until 1954, and Carpenter just ran. Bob ran everything, and he tried to stick to Pennant's plan, but it was Pennant's plan, and I think they would have. It would be interesting to see. I think they would have been better off.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I kind of rambled there a little bit.
No, that's fine. No. Talking about the pitching, I think one of the things that surprised me in the book, I knew Constantine had a caught lightning in a bottle that year, but the stories about him coming and relieving for 9-10 innings. I mean,
Yeah.
and then the story about I forget the game, but Roberts threw a complete game with 79 pitches.
Yes.
I mean, you just don't hear that today. And you'll never hear it again.
And
That was one question
Robert threw
I wanted to
28
ask.
complete games in a row or something like that.
What was that, RJ?
No, that was one question I wanted to ask you. You had a couple of games in your book where you had pitch counts, and I was wondering were people, did you have access to pitch count data, or was that just
It was in the news accounts. Sometimes they would just talk about it in the body of the story.
oh, I'll have to look at those.
And I think there's some that Baseball Reference will show pitch counts too
Yeah, they don't.
for some games, but it's kind of inconsistent.
Yeah, before the 1980s, it is. Okay, sorry to interrupt. I just I saw that.
Occasionally, I would run across. I'd have to go back to the specific games I don't remember, but I do remember. I've run across pinch. Just them saying, "Oh, he only threw 79 pitches tonight," or whatever. I don't think they were kept. So I think pitch counts have been kept around for a while, but I'm not sure they were used in the same way. To say, oh, he's got to be out by 90 pitches or 100 pitches, or how effective he is. I'm not sure it was data that was used in terms of how effective and whether we should pull him because he's always ineffective after pitch 90. But I think there were people counting how many pitches were thrown.
Yeah, going off what Frank said with just like the differences in the pitching, the thing that kind of took me aback was I don't remember exactly when it was, if it was towards the end of the '50 season coming down the stretch, just how often Robin Roberts was pitching.
Yes.
I think at one point you said they were able to give him his normal 3 days rest. It's just crazy how different the of a pitching I guess workload was viewed at the time.
Well, I think there was an advantage in that he was really a fastball pitcher. He didn't throw a whole lot other than that. So I think it was a lot less strain on his arm. And then if you look, there's a photo of him in the book when he was at Michigan State, and just look at those tree trunk legs. I mean, you've got that foundation that you can see why he had that durability. But it is amazing. I mean, even for that time, it was amazing. You know, like I said, he set a record, a post dead ball era record in complete games in a row. And down the stretch, I think he pitched 3 times in 6 days. But what happened to the Phillies? Well, you had Russ Meyer, who was battling elbow chips all season, and then on top of that, then in a 1 week span, you lost Simmons to military duty. Miller, who was favoring his back and wasn't as effective, had his shoulder seize up on him, and then Bubba Church gets hit in the eye by Ted Kluszewski. And so I think that was between September 9th and the 16th, somewhere in there. So they really didn't have anybody left. Meyer couldn't pitch very often because of his elbow. If he did, he wasn't going to be effective at all. So you really had Constanti and Roberts were the only people that they tried. Heinzelman a little bit, and he had a couple wins in September, but he'd really had to come down from a great 49 season, the only winning season I think he had in his career. So there weren't a lot of options, and I talk about the similarities to 64 when Gene Mauch, he only had confidence in Jim Bunning and Chris Short. And ironically, they had let 2 years earlier, Mauch had let Simmons and Robin Roberts go for nothing. And if they just held on to them and had them with Bunning and Short, now they may not have traded for Bunning if they had those two, they'd have been fine. I mean, Simmons and I think Simmons won 18 games that year and Roberts 13, and both of them won several games in September, so they were healthy. But yeah, pitching was such a key back then. It is today in a different way, but you really relied on a couple of people, and it's such a bygone era. I kind of miss it. I mean, I remember the days when I would go to a game, there's a weekend series coming, and I'd figure out what's the best pitching matchup that I want to see. I want to see Steve Carlton against Gaylord Perry or something. I want to see a good pitching matchup, and you'd see these guys try to go 9. I do miss that.
There's a
Go ahead.
question on the chat, and I think the answer is yes, based on what you have here. But is there any truth to the story that Roy Campanella tried to get a tryout with the Phillies?
Yeah, Campanella, this is another one where I kind of went back. Campanella, in his autobiography, talks about this incident. He places it in 1945, but he talks about Hans Lobert and Nugent, so it would place it in 42. But other than that, yes, it appears that was true. He was a Philadelphia native, and he was pretty young at the time. I don't think he was probably much more than 20, 21, but he'd already played 2 or 3 years in the Negro Leagues at that time. And he really wanted to play for the Phillies, but that's my understanding. Now, the story about whether Bill Veeck wanted to actually field an all Negro League team, I'm a little more skeptical of that. There's been some good SABR research work on that. There's differing opinions on that, and we'll probably never know how serious he was or if he was serious. Just as probably with Veeck, we don't know how serious he was about anything. He was a character, and he liked being a character. So,
As a Veeck fan, I hope it's true, but yeah, I agree with you. The evidence is not.
I think it occurred to him, but how serious he was, I suspect that may have grown over the years, because he didn't turn around and do that in St. Louis and Cleveland when he had the open opportunity to do it. He did sign Blackline, but he didn't sign an all-star team.
Right.
You reference Stan Baumgartner a lot in the book, his reporting. How was the sports writers in Philadelphia during the 1950 season? Were they getting on the bandwagon, or were they saying, just wait, something's going to happen? They're going to flub it? What was the writing of the press at that time?
They were definitely believers. Um, I think they recognized even in 47, 48, when the team wasn't really, uh, they weren't winning yet. They were still in the second division, but they could see there was a difference. First of all, I think the attitude changed because, okay, you got these young players like Richie Ashburn and Robin Roberts and Kurt Simmons, and they're keeping them. And so I think that was different than what had happened. And I think they knew Carpenter, and Carpenter had a very good relationship with the press. I mean, he talked about that at the beginning, is that he was going to be open and talk to them. His very first press conference in 44 talked about he'll be open and he's going to trust them until he has reason not to trust them. And so I think the Phillies had a really good relationship with the press, and I think the reporters kind of fell in line with that because they could see the difference. You know, Baumgartner was an ex-player, so he could definitely see the difference. He'd played for the Phillies, he played for the A's, and you know, he definitely was positive about it. So I think they just saw the difference in the way the franchise was being operated, which was pretty obvious from the way it had been operated before.
How financially successful was the team as far as when the Carpenters, of course, they infused some money. They
Right.
would sign bonus babies and things like that. But as far as the attendance and was it maintaining the team enough to where um, they would be successful financially into the late 50s and maybe be able to continue to sign or trade for players that were of higher caliber?
Well, they were very successful in 50. They made money. They made some money in the late 40s, right after the war. But I would say after 51, they struggled a bit financially. All of baseball was struggling. And so I think it was a little tough for them. Um, Carpenter had Carpenter had the money to carry through, and so I don't think they were financially strapped. I mean, he lent the team $450,000. I have their general ledger from that time period. I wish it had payroll records, but I do have. There's a little, as an aside, there's a little talk about it. At one point, the players were, I think it was in 49, were taking advantage of just writing for their meals. And they said, you're going to get $6 a day now. And you can see in the ledger, there's the $6 they were giving them out. But anyway, the thing that hurt them probably more than anything was the cost of the minor league farm system. And I think that hurt them in that their farm system shrunk in the 50s, as all farm systems did, because again, not only, you know, Major League Baseball was having trouble, minor league baseball was really having trouble financially. And the money they were having to throw in, at one time they owned 5 teams outright, and they had, I think, a farm system of 11 or 12. That was costing them a lot of money. And probably at the major league level, they were coming close to breaking even, but the money they were investing in Utica and Terre Haute and some of the other, and Wilmington really cost them a lot of money. Over time, they ended up folding that franchise. They ended up moving. Um, that was probably as big a drain as anything in the 50s. And so it kind of then fed on itself. They weren't putting money in the farm system, and the farm system isn't producing. And then they're not going out and signing, uh, you know, Negro League or Caribbean players. So the pipeline starts getting constricted, and they're just trying to find obvious, you know, they think Fred Van Dusen, who's the New York State High School Player of the Year, that's the guy. And his career consists of one at bat where he got hit by a pitch. Um, you know, Mac Burke, you know, some other folks. And the Korean War played a role in this too, where it took some players away who maybe had some potential, and they lost 2 or 3 years and they weren't the same. So that's probably a long way of answering that question, but I think the cost of the minor leagues maybe hurt them as much as anything in that then they constricted it. They didn't have money to keep that going or the will to do so. And again, you didn't have a general manager who could counter the owner. The owner's writing the check, and when there's nothing between him and that, I think he's going to see, why am I keep writing these $90,000 checks to Utica or whatever, and we're not getting players out of it. But then you're not going to get players out of it if you don't put any money into it. So I think that hurt him.
We talked a lot about players. Could you talk a little bit about Eddie Sawyer? I mean, how he went from kind of like the golden boy in a way, as far as being a manager with the team, and then how he became disillusioned later on in his stint with the Phillies.
That was really an interesting aspect of it. And Eddie Sawyer, you'd see more often than not. And then, again, this is wading through things because there's some people who are going to never criticize anybody. They don't like to criticize people. So you kind of have to wade through all the different accounts about people and figure out who's talking and why they're saying the things they are. And my impression of Eddie Sawyer is that he liked being like a college professor where you have teachers' assistants who do a lot of the things. And there's a strength to that. The Phillies had a coaching staff that was really a coaching staff, and they really tried to develop players where at a time when a lot of times the the coaches were just the friends of the manager, guy I played with and I like him and he'll go get stuff for me and talk to the players once in a while. But the Phillies really, they had schools they were setting up around the country because Joe Reardon was brought in to run the farm system and was serious. And so, and Sawyer to me was kind of like that. He didn't communicate that much with the players. You'd keep running across players say, well, Eddie said he never really said anything to me. Robin Roberts kind of said that. Ed Sinicki, a guy that I interviewed for A Glimpse of Fame, talked about that Eddie Sawyer never really communicated. So I saw him vacillate between being easy on players and hard. You would see that over time where he would say, we're going to loosen up and everybody's just going to, this game isn't that much fun when you don't win and, make light of things. And then you go, well, now I got to be hard on these guys because they're goofing off. And so then it's no wives, no fun, no nothing. And then he'd loosen up again and try. And I'm not sure how good a feel he had for managing people. I think he could manage a system. And if he had the right people in that system, which he did in 49, 50, 51, they were still successful in the early 50s. They just didn't get over the hump, mostly because of pitching, I think. And they just didn't have the team. It was talent. I don't think it was that, but he would cast about for a way to, how do I get these guys to respond? And I think you're talking about guys who won early. You're talking about your key guys are in their early to mid 20s. They're not fully baked yet, and as people. And I think he didn't adjust to saying, okay, these aren't just kids I'm going to order around. I need to treat them a little differently. And I don't think he ever found that right balance after 1950. It was, he'd try a lot of different things. And I think he tried to manage everybody the same way versus individually getting to know the guy. The successful managers, to me, if you look, they're the ones who, you know, uh, understand different players are different. Miller Huggins didn't manage everybody on the Yankees the same way. John McGraw didn't even manage everybody on the Giants the same way. They were individuals, and some guys you got to kick them in the butt, and some guys you got to pat them on the back. And I'm not sure Sawyer was that kind guy. I think he was more of a system guy, but that's me talking from the outside 60 years later. You know, I wasn't there, but that's just kind of the impression that I have. he definitely never got control of the team in the same way. That's for certain. You never got the feeling that he had a feel for how he should manage these guys. I think as far as in the game and stuff, yeah, he was great in that. And I think, but I think Emore had to have. I mean, he even assigned at one point a liaison to the other players who were complaining about he designated a coach, go to him. Well, that's kind of an interesting approach and tells you a lot, I think.
There was a picture in your book. This is kind of getting off the subject of the players and on-field personnel, but there was a picture in your book of Delanis coming across the plate in 1956 after hitting a home run, being greeted by I'm trying to see who it was. When he broke Chuck Klein's record, I think it was.
Right.
And I don't know if I'm going to pronounce the gentleman's name correctly. Henry Wretch.
I think so. I don't know either.
The team mascot.
Yeah.
I was surprised to see the team still had mascots. That
I was too.
I mean, I knew that was a thing back in the 20s and 30s, but I mean, did you ever find out anything about this gentleman or how long he was with the team or how long he lasted?
No, I just saw the picture, and so I went back through articles in 56 looking for, he obviously was not a bat boy.
No.
He looked like I've seen mascots before and then found references to him, so that's how he got his name. I never found out much about what happened to him afterwards. I don't think he was the mascot for very long, but the last the last time a mascot was used in the major leagues that I'm aware of, and it was a real stunt, was with the Oakland A's when Charlie Finley was there. He had a young man, a 12-year-old that he named team vice president, named Stanley Burrell. He looked just like Hank Aaron, but his job really was to snitch on the players. And and he ended up becoming the rap guy Hammer.
Oh, right.
Oh my word.
That's right.
Can't touch this. That was it, and so it's fascinating. But when he was, I remember when he was there, and there were, I'd watch games and you'd see him once in a while, and he looked like a miniature Hank Aaron. His facially, he looked just like Hank Aaron. It was really, and that's how he got the nickname Hammer and Hank Aaron. That's how he got the nickname Hammer, and he used it
Oh wow.
on into his career. So that wasn't really a mascot, but it was kind of played that way. So, but yeah, no, I would love to know more about him, but actually that came when I was putting the pictures together as I'm nearing right at the deadline, and so um, I just identified him, but I don't know much about him.
Anybody else have any questions for Dennis?
Yeah, something I really enjoyed kind of going into the backstories of a lot of the different players, and was particularly really interested in the whole event, I guess, of the Phillies, signing Kurt Simmons and trucking the team up there to play. That's something that's just kind of hard to wrap your head around. But I was wondering, as you were kind of researching these players' backstories, if there was any in particular that you found really interesting that you didn't, you weren't familiar with before you started, your research.
Well, I think there were several. I think Simmons, I did not know that the Phillies had gone up to Egypt, and that whole situation of playing a game up there. I think that was fascinating. Certainly Jim Constanti and the struggles of his early career and turning it around thanks to his next door neighbor, Undertaker / pitching coach. That was really interesting. I love beginnings and endings, as you can probably tell. I love how things start and then how they end, even more than the heights of people's success. I like, seeing how did that success define them and impact them later in life. And so I found even the stuff about, to me, one of my favorite chapters to research and write about and think about was really Roberts and Simmons after the Philly, leaving the Phillies and afterwards. And I think people write less about that, but that's always the areas that I'm most interested in, because I think people are more human in those situations. They don't seem so invincible, and it's kind of interesting. Their personalities come out, and um, so I think all of that. I think I'm always fascinated with the backgrounds of people when they start and how they got started, and then who they become, and then who they are after fame defines them to a certain extent. All of these guys who played for the Whiz Kids were defined as Whiz Kids after that. And, everyone, I think, as I note, everyone in their obituary was going to be noted as a Whiz Kid. And how do you feel about that? Most of them were very happy about it, but, they had, even though they didn't win the World Series, they were on a famous team, and they were the talk of the sports world at a certain point. And every player wants that, to be a part of something like that. And they did achieve that.
Well, Simmons won a World Series with St. Louis. Am I correct?
He did. He
So
did.
did you ever hear anything about whether he took more satisfaction in being connected with the Whiz Kids or with the championship team in St. Louis?
I would say it was definitely more about the Whiz Kids. I think he was really happy he finally got his chance. He didn't get to pitch in the 50 World Series. He was there. He was on leave. Could have been activated, but he wasn't sure he wanted to be. And the Phillies didn't want to put him in a no-win situation where he might fail, and there could be criticism as to, well, he's in the Army. Why does he get a pass to play? So he wasn't activated, and took him. But he thought afterwards, Phillies are going to win plenty more times, going to get more chances. And it took 14 years. And ironically, he got to pitch against the Yankees, the team he would have pitched against in 50. I think he definitely, despite his protestations otherwise, I think he definitely took affront at the Phillies dropping him. I mean, he went 16-2 against them in his first 18 decisions, and 19-6 over his career against them. He had a big role in knocking them out in 64. I think he beat them 3 or 4 times in September. And so I can't believe that wasn't part of his motivation to have such a great record against them. But I think if you look back at his post career, it was really about the Phillies, even though he was with the Cardinals for 6 years. And over 7 different seasons, he was a Cardinal for a long time. But I would say he definitely identified as a Whiz Kid more than any. He lived in the area. All of his best player friends were Phillies from that era. And, I think he took my impression, it has to be my impression because I didn't interview him, was that he really identified as a Philly more than anything else.
You had the quote later on after he pitched in the 64 World Series that if he had pitched in the 1950 World Series, he was young and he wouldn't have appreciated it as much. But...
Yeah, right. Right. I mean, getting that, something just occurred to me talking about background and beginnings and endings. One of the more fascinating pieces to me was Robin Roberts at Reading, trying to keep or Reading, I guess. Do you say Reading or Reading?
Reading.
Reading. At Reading, trying to keep his career going. I find those things like that to me are just really interesting, and how people react to it and how they deal with it. And I liked his interaction with Howie Bedell and all that. And so that's why those things are in there, because I enjoy them. I mean, if you're going to write something, you got to be interested in it. So.
And he also went on to have a successful career with the was it the Florida, one of the colleges down in
Oh,
Florida
yeah,
as a
yeah,
coach.
right.
And I
Yes,
think
he
his,
did.
wasn't his son, um, long time, like 17-year manager at West Point on the
I
baseball
think he
team,
was.
or coach, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. Roberts had a really successful, well, and he was influential. He was so respected. I mean, the whole piece with
Mhm.
Marvin Miller, and, I
Mhm.
talked recently to Jack Hyatt, who was on the Angels, and he was on the Giants in '66 when Roberts came through, well, when they were talking about Marvin Miller. And basically, I don't, talk out of school here, but it was on the record with me. He talked about that the Giants players were kind of intimidated by management not to vote for Miller. And then they brought Roberts in, and Roberts talked them, and they voted, I think, except for a couple votes, to vote Miller in. That's how much influence Roberts had at the end of his career. I mean, that's 1966. That's in spring training. That's before his last major league season, and he wasn't even a player rep at that point. But they were using him. Uh, the players were, because he carried a lot of weight with players. He's very respected. And I thought that was interesting.
Did being player rep have any negative effect on his relationship with the team ownership, team owners? I mean,
Well, I
what's
do wonder if he didn't get a chance. In '67 with Reading, he pitched well enough that, maybe someone would have given him a shot. I don't know whether that impacted his chances there or not. I mean, he got bounced around from Houston to Chicago in '66, and then
even a brief stint up in New York where he didn't play, but I mean, he passed through
right
New
with the
York.
Yankees. Yeah, he was on the Yankees for a week in '61 and didn't, or '62, and didn't appear in a game. Yeah. So yeah, it could have um, had some bouncing, because yeah, he did bounce around. 60 and 61, he wasn't really treated as well as he had been, and suffered through some rough stints as well. But it probably didn't help.
Yeah.
Roberts used to come to Iowa when I lived there. I never got to meet him, but he used to come to the Bob Feller Museum when
Oh,
Bob
okay.
Feller was and do events with Bob. And I never got to meet him, but I never heard a bad thing said about him. Everyone just, thought he was a friendly, great guy. And,
I have not, in any of my readings, writings, uh, limited talking to people that have involved him, same thing here. Everybody speaks really highly of him.
Well, anybody else have anything for Dennis? If not, Dennis, I want to thank you so much. And if you're watching this on recording, pick up this book. I think you'll really enjoy it. Even if you're not a Phillies fan, I think you'll find it a really good read. And before we let you go, Dennis, as I said, this was your fifth book. Do you have anything in the works?
Well, I'm deciding on a couple things. I've been working on a couple things. One possibility might involve another Phillies legend as a biography, but I don't want to go any further than that.
Well, we won't ask you to divulge any more other than the fact, is it an older player or a more current player?
No, it'd be an older player.
Okay, good. Look forward to it.
It might be someone who is in this era.
Good.
So,
Okay. Well,
but
Dennis, oh, go
I'll
ahead.
know that probably in the next month or so whether I'm going to go in that direction.
Excellent. Well, we can't thank you enough for getting up early and uh talking with us and telling us about your book and how you came about writing the story of a team that here in the Philadelphia area. I'll say we're in the Philadelphia area, even though we're not exactly that close. And I think if there's three teams that people from the Philadelphia area remember, it's the Whiz Kids, the '64 team, and the 80 team for winning the first World Series. So I appreciate you joining us and filling us in on how you researched the book and telling us some stories about the players and the front office. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Take care.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis.
Bye.
Guys, I'm going to stop recording. Dennis,